Welcome to the Basic Media Studio lunchtime talk. I've been doing these for nearly 4 years now, and I've still got a script in my hand. Very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming, and those of you joining us online. If you don't know much about the Basic Media Studio, there's loads of info on our website, so I'm not going to go into great detail here, but these talks are part of the Open Studio Friday offer. And every Friday, we throw open our doors to people to come and hot desk and hang out with us from 10 till 5 p.m. Most of you will be familiar with this housekeeping stuff, but there is a quiet space just there. Help yourself to a cup and tea. Feel free to move around. And you know, who doesn't know where the fire exits are? Great, good. People online, you don't need to worry about that. So a captioned version of the talk will be available on the same link if you're watching online when this talk is finished. This week's talk is by Edward King, who is an associate professor in the School of Modern Languages at the University of Bristol. And his research explores digital cultures in Latin America and beyond, with a particular interest in the use of speculative aesthetics to frame the politics of emerging technologies.
That's right.
There we
That's
go.
Right.
Didn't trip over that one. He's going to talk today about how Brazil has long been at the forefront of developing cultural strategies that support digital inclusion. This is my last ever talk in the building before I move on to a new role. So thanks, much appreciated. At the end, we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in the new year in events, but for now, I'd like to hand over to Ed.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to come and talk. I'm together with a colleague in theatre at the University of Bristol. We're setting up a new Centre for Creative Technologies, and we're collaborating lots with the Pervasive Media Studio, so hopefully this will be, so this time we've done a few events in collaboration. Hopefully there's going to be more and more in the new year. So, okay, so yeah, my talk is on speculative digital literacies in Brazil. And so over the past few years, I've been involved with this project with partners in Brazil, the aim of which, kind of very broadly speaking, is to explore creative approaches to the development of new digital literacies that effectively support social inclusion, specifically in the Brazilian context. My research focuses more generally on sort of digital cultures in Latin America, and I'm particularly interested in examining the role of cultural texts and objects, including video games, comics, science fiction, to challenge dominant ideological assumptions behind digital technologies. So in one project, which culminated in this book, I examined how the graphic novel and kind of comics more generally have been used as a medium through which to kind of explore emerging digital subjectivities in the 21st century. And one of the chapters was about an artist called Rafael Coutinho, he produced this series of comics called O Beijo Adolescente, which I think has been turned into a Brazilian Netflix series that's coming out soon. Not sure if that'll be available over here, but I think hopefully it will. So while researching the book, Rafael and I became friends. We spoke together on a panel in a comics festival in Colombia, in Bogota, quite sort of randomly, and started to devise ways to collaborate. And then at the same time, I'd been having a conversation, a kind of ongoing conversation with a guy called Felipe Fonseca, who was one of the founders in 2002 of a project titled Meta Reciclagem. And this was a network of media activists who ran a series of workshops focused on recycling supposedly obsolete computer hardware for use in deprived areas of Brazil. And Meta Reciclagem proposed a philosophy of what they labeled gambiarra. That's a Brazilian term used to describe kind of creative appropriations of technologies and everyday objects in the context of social and economic precarity. So Felipe and I had been having this ongoing conversation about the use of digital technologies to overcome social inequalities and how the challenges we face today in terms of digital inclusion are very different from the ones he faced in the early 2000s, at a time when there was lots of funding in Brazil for digital inclusion projects as part of the Lula administration of the time, the left-wing administration of the time. So in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, we got some money from the university to start a project with two main aims. Firstly, to revisit the theme of digital inclusion, which was a central pillar of digital media activism in the 2000s in Brazil, and think about whether that concept is still useful today, or sort of how the challenges have changed and all those kinds of things. And then secondly, to explore how creative approaches to digital literacies can help support the goals of a renewed vision of digital inclusion. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is just explore the theme, is firstly sort of start by exploring the theme of digital inclusion, specifically in the context of Brazil, and then move on to describe creative responses to two of the most urgent of contemporary challenges. So, starting with digital inclusion, inclusão digital. So during the early 2000s, while Lula was president the first time around, and obviously he's coming back to power in January, which is great, excellent news, and is making all of these projects suddenly possible in a way that, you know, they were being sort of shut down. Brazil became pioneers, so in the early 2000s, in the use of creative approaches to digital inclusion. So one of the guiding principles of this movement were the connected concepts of gambiarra and anthropophagia, which is a Brazilian term for cultural cannibalism. So in 2003, Lula appointed Gilberto Gil as Minister of Culture, and Gil was one of the icons. This is him back in the 60s. He was one of the icons of the artistic movement Tropicalia, which flourished during the late 1960s in its opposition to the military regime, and styled itself as heir to the cannibalistic spirit, which was most clearly articulated in this by the modernist artist Oswaldo de Andrade in the 1920s. So in his manifesto, in his Anthropophagus Manifesto, the Cannibalist Manifesto, published in 1928, Andrade appropriated the figure of the indigenous cannibal as a model for critically devouring cultural influences from abroad. And this became a really kind of influential sort of model for cultural criticism in Brazil. And the Tropicalia artists, such as Gil and Caetano Veloso, who's the other character here, borrowed this metaphor in the 60s for their fusion of Afro-Brazilian rhythms and British psychedelic rock. And as Minister for Culture, Gil used Tropicalia's kind of updated version of anthropophagy, of cannibalism, as a framework for thinking about how digital media and the networks they enable can facilitate a cultural cannibalism of creative borrowing and remix. So the Cultura Viva project that Gil established at this time provided a structure for this digital cultural cannibalism, and cultural centers called Pontos de Cultura were set up across the country to provide a creative space for communities to experiment with digital technologies. By 2010, there were more than 1,500 of them spread across Brazil. So the communities that sprang up around these centers were a seedbed for media activist movements, such as Meta-Reciclagem, which I mentioned, but also Media Tática, which articulated the aims of the free software movement with Brazilian cultural traditions of creative critical appropriation, and there were lots more as well. So these organizations kind of lost momentum a little bit during the second half of the 2010s as government priorities changed and also the cultural context shifted. And perhaps it also has something to do with the consolidation of platform capitalism, the increasing domination of access to the internet by big tech platforms. Most of the organizations came under threat of complete eradication during the regime of the far-right president Jair Bolsonaro from 2019. So Rafael, Felipe, and I thought that the first stage of our project should be to speak to the people involved in non-profit organizations and community technology organizations who have been working on digital inclusion initiatives in Brazil since this period, since the early 2000s, and to kind of map the terrain of digital inclusion initiatives in the country. So we carried out a series of filmed interviews with leaders of 12 organizations, including Instituto Procomum, which is based in Santos, in Sao Paulo State, and Coletivo Digital, which is based in Sao Paulo. So this is the report we put together. We posed the participants, here are some of them, 4 questions around the theme of digital inclusion, asking for their perspectives on what the term means in the current context, how its parameters have changed since the 2000s, and what the main challenges they face now are. So most of the participants pointed out that in the early 2000s, the aim of digital inclusion initiatives was mainly to give communities access to digital technologies and networks. So access was the main focus then. However, now that there are extremely high levels of smartphone ownership and social media usage in Brazil, it's become clear that access to digital networks is not a guarantee of social inclusion, but can entail exposure to manipulation and data surveillance. And this became increasingly clear in the run-up to the last elections in Brazil in 2018. And as a result, the focus among governmental and non-profit organizations working in this area has shifted from access to supporting digital literacies across the social spectrum, as well as creating alternative strategies of accessing digital networks. In other words, inclusion is no longer sufficient as a goal on its own, but needs to be accompanied by specific digital literacy skills. And from the interviews, 2 skills emerged as being of particular urgency. Firstly, the identification of online disinformation, particularly on social media. And secondly, the identification of what has been referred to as algorithmic racism, a term used to describe the embedding of racial biases in software systems, such as facial recognition technologies and search engines. So for the rest of this talk, what I'm going to do is describe each of these challenges a little bit in their context, and then talk a little bit about creative responses to them, both the ones we're developing and ones that have sort of inspired us, I guess. So starting with online disinformation. So this emerged as a kind of real issue during the last presidential elections in 2018, and was cited by loads of reports at the time and subsequently as a major factor in Bolsonaro's rise to power. It was also an important factor in cultures of denial during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this problem is particularly acute in Brazil due to the centrality of social media platforms in everyday life. So Brazilians spend more time on social media than any country outside of the US, an average of 3.5 hours daily. Social media has not only become a primary source of news, but also a kind of key part of governmental communicational infrastructure, which is why when WhatsApp went down for a few hours last year, about this time last year, it caused serious disruption in Brazil, while elsewhere it was just a kind of minor inconvenience. In Brazil, it's a kind of really serious issue. More than 90% of the country's internet users are on WhatsApp, mainly due to zero rating strategies used by network providers, which exempt the use of certain platforms from data caps. So in 2018, I think it was 2 of Brazil's biggest mobile providers began zero rating WhatsApp. So by then, doctors and dentists, delivery people, and others were relying on WhatsApp to confirm appointments and orders. It just became a part of the infrastructure of the country. So that's why it also became such an effective vehicle for the spread of disinformation during the 2018 presidential campaigns. And as has been kind of quite widely reported, the Bolsonaro campaign became really successful in harnessing WhatsApp, getting the numbers of private WhatsApp groups through evangelical churches, and then using those to spread disinformation to gather support for the Bolsonaro cause. So since 2018, governmental and non-governmental organizations, such as Global Network Initiative and the Brazilian organization Direitos na Rede, have been attempting to tackle the issue at the levels of policy and law, including through the regulation of content moderation. So for the next stage of our project, the project I'm running with Rafael and Felipe, we sort of set out to support the organizations who contributed to that report, to the ID21 report, which are looking to tackle disinformation at the level of reception primarily, particularly among the marginalized communities that they are embedded within. So I guess sort of slightly naively, perhaps, we set out to develop a video game that would encourage these communities, and particularly young people within these communities, to think critically about the spread of disinformation through social media. Rafael and I put together a team that included a creative technologist and a science fiction writer called Alini Valecki to come up with an initial structure and aesthetic. And in the game, which we're calling Futuro Chama, or Future Call, the player starts off by reading a kind of celebrity news site when she or he receives a mysterious message from somebody claiming to be from the future. And in this future version of Brazil in 2068, big tech platforms have completely saturated what used to be known as the internet. One of the repercussions of which is the rampant spread of disinformation. So the sender of the message, who is called Chico, is a member of a resistance group, and while carrying out some kind of digital archaeological research, has stumbled upon the ability to communicate with ghosts of computer users trapped within software systems. So Chico asks the player for help with his or her media archaeology, help in identifying the promise of alternative forms of the internet buried in his past and the player's present. Alternate futures that will be effaced by the growing dominance of big tech. So this takes the player on this journey through alternative internet cultures in Brazil, including the free software movement of the 90s and the digital inclusion initiatives of the 2000s. And all the while, an AI influencer from 2068 called Magra Luz attempts to sort of stop the player's progress through distraction tactics that continually undermine the distinction between fiction and reality. So I had a meeting with the game developers. So yeah, it started off, we put together a team of people, none of whom really had that much experience of specifically gaming. And then earlier this year, we got hold of some extra funding. I thought, right, now's the time to kind of partner up with some people who actually know what they're doing. So our Game Lab, we're really happy to come on board, and they had experience in producing kind of persuasive games, social games. And this is one of their games about the history of the Sertão region in the northeast. Yesterday I had a meeting with them, and like it's coming together. It suddenly is like a game that you can play. So if you want to have a tinker with the first, so far we've just got as far as having that bit where you just have to figure out the interface. And but yeah, if you want to have a look, there's there. I'm not sure we have time to do that now in the talk. So the project is ongoing. We're going to set up a series of workshops in the new year, sort of beta testing workshops, and then we're going to see where it takes us basically. Okay. So the second big issue that arose from the interviews was algorithmic racism. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to explain a little bit about what this means, particularly in the context of Brazil, and outline some plans for creative approaches on this issue, although this is a project that's at even more of an embryonic stage. So yeah, feedback and ideas are really, really helpful. So during the collapse of the Partido Trabalhador, or the Workers' Party regime that led up to the presidential election in 2018, Facebook and WhatsApp, as we've been talking about, became the vehicles for this steep rise in racist discourse among Bolsonaro's power base. But media activists at the time pointed out how this overt racism on social media networks concealed a more insidious type of racism within digital cultures, namely the ways in which racist assumptions are embedded in the software of the main portals of information on the internet. For example, in 2017, the Brazilian NGO Desabafo Social exposed the racist premises of search engines employed by popular online photographic databases such as Shutterstock and Getty Images, by demonstrating that the results for the search term family were images of exclusively white families. And they posted a video of this and sort of caused a debate around it. Another example, in November 2019, Instagram blocked a cartoon image of a black child in a favela because it mistook his skateboard for a gun, so the image recognition did. And in his timeline of algorithmic racism in Brazil, the Brazilian critic and researcher Tarcísio Silva points out that by November 2019, more than 90% of prisoners caught as a result of facial recognition technologies in Brazil were black. As a report published in The Intercept puts it, facial recognition has proved to be a high-tech update for the old racisms that are foundational to the criminal justice system and have been guiding police work in Brazil for decades. So a number of organizations have set out to confront algorithmic racism in Brazil. In 2017, the charitable organization Olabi, which campaigns for the democratization of the production of technology in Brazil, launched a new initiative called Preta Lab, which aims at stimulating the inclusion of more black women in innovation and technology. And the director of Preta Lab, Silvana Bahia, argues that it's important to shift the focus and debates around digital equality from access to production, so echoing what came through in the reports that we put together. So Bahia's perspective echoes that of critics such as Lisa Nakamura, who, in the face of attempts, so she published this book in 2007 called Digitizing Race, which was really influential. And in the face of attempts at the time to position the internet as a kind of colorblind space, she called for the need to, and this is a quotation from her, pass the multiple gradations and degrees of access to digital media and the ways that these shadings are contingent on variables such as class, position, race, nationality, and gender, end quote. So in my own research, sort of on the side of these collaborations, I've become really interested in artistic activist projects in Brazil that employ a sort of variation on Afrofuturist aesthetics, although never directly Afrofuturist aesthetics, to confront the issue of algorithmic racism and kind of imagine alternatives. Sorry, these are other examples that I'll skip over briefly. This is a great film, by the way. I'm not going to talk about it now, but it's brilliant. Sort of very loose avant-garde take on Afrofuturist aesthetics in Brazil. But I'm going to move on to talk about Victoria Cribb. So Victoria Cribb, oh no, maybe I will give some context. I think maybe that's better. Yeah, give some more context about Afrofuturist aesthetics in Brazil, and particularly, which is what interests me, its connections with media activism. So activists advocating for black rights in Brazil have seized on Afrofuturism as a language of empowerment. So the Brazilian critic Nathalie Neri defines it as, she's got a very sort of simple but useful definition, the radical idea that black people will exist in the future because to think about black people in the future is to think about them as being alive. So this deceptively simple definition evokes a number of contexts, both specific to Brazil and pertaining to the African diaspora more generally. The notion that thinking of black people in Brazil as being alive is radical highlights the reality that in Brazil, it's much harder to stay alive if you happen to be black. So according to a report published by the Institute of Economic Research, more than 75% of murder victims in Brazil in 2018 were black. Furthermore, the proposition that thinking of black people as being alive is an act of speculative fiction draws attention to the central role of anti-blackness in the discourses of modernity. So the project of Afrofuturism proposed by Neri is the articulation of conceptions of blackness that disrupt the vein of anti-blackness that's central to the kind of discourses of modernity. And as the critic Reynaldo Anderson puts it, Afrofuturism is a critical project with the mission of laying the groundwork for humanity that is not bound up with the ideals of white Enlightenment universalism. So much Afrofuturist cultural production in Brazil connects this search for disruptive conceptions of blackness with the search for alternative forms of mediation. Just as Afrofuturist artists reject inclusion within definitions of the human that are grounded in exclusion and repression, they avoid forms of mediation that have historically served to reinforce distinctions between elite cultural producers and passive consumers, between subjects and objects of thought. There are examples across a number of media in Brazil. Bands such as Tantau e Os Fita convey oppositional conceptions of blackness through a form of sound production that unsettles linear temporality through a conflation of traditional Afro-Brazilian rhythms and futuristic electronic sounds, while appealing primarily to a kind of embodied mode of cognition. So films such as Branco Sai, Preto Fica by Adile Queiroz, which came out in 2014, combine a sort of documentary interest in the history of black oppression with science fiction plot lines involving intergalactic detectives and time travel. So the result are films and cultural objects that are transformative of both dominant conceptions of blackness and generic media traditions. So yeah, it's useful to give a bit of background on this film. The director, Queiroz, set out to make a documentary about these victims of state violence who lived in the periphery of Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, but then made it in sort of collaboration with his interviewees. And they insisted that the film not be a kind of standard documentary in which they were the kind of objects of scrutiny, but turned it into this kind of pretty eccentric science fiction film. So it's a kind of really odd generic combination, and the sort of generic hybridity of it emulates some of the things it's trying to say about race. So yeah, finally moving on to Victoria Crib. The Rio de Janeiro-based Victoria Crib combines these two traditions of media activism and artistic Afrofuturism. The political agenda that informs her work is closely aligned with that of Preta Lab, which I mentioned, in its attempt to sort of negotiate identities of blackness in Brazil away from their status as digital objects and move them towards digital subjecthood, in the words of Silvana Bahia, the person who runs Preta Lab. So Crib contests algorithmic racism on its own ground by using social media as a platform for her performance of what could be described as a kind of black critical posthumanism. A recurring preoccupation of Crib's work are parallels between black bodies and digital bodies. As she explains, this is the first quotation here, I associate real bodies that are not included within normative conceptions of whiteness with digital bodies. Both are culturally visible to a high degree whilst also being excluded from fully participating within a discriminatory social order. So her work kind of traces this parallel because she believes that new media art has a fundamental role in combating racial and gender inequalities. And this is where the second quote comes in. The language and aesthetics of digital technology are still centered on white male bodies. So what I'm trying to do is re-signify this space. So in her enactment of this resignification, Crib deploys a number of aesthetic strategies, including the creative appropriation of face filters. But what I'm going to, just to stick within the time, I'm going to focus on one strategy, which is glitch aesthetics, her use of glitch aesthetics. So this is a still from her 2019 work of video art titled Command Prompt. And the 10-minute video combines this really elliptical science fiction narrative with 3D render images. And the narrative unfolds on a Windows command prompt text box as we watch a user called Victoria describe her experiences of being a black artificial being. And the effect is first to critique how online identity has, in the words of Andre Brock Jr., been conflated with whiteness, even as whiteness is itself signified as a universal, raceless, techno-cultural identity, end quote. And it does so by introducing a glitch into a commonly used computer interface, the default command line interface for a number of operating systems since the 80s. And as the narrative of digital enslavement unfolds on the screen, images sort of glitch in and out, such as this one. And I just want to end on this concept of the glitch. Glitches can emerge from the incompatibility between two interfacing systems, and as such draw attention to the rules governing both of these systems, the logics of exclusion that maintain their coherence, and the interpretations through which they separate kind of signal from noise. But these glitches can also, in their unpredictability, open up glimpses of alternative systems. And these sort of, the paradoxically staged glitches in Cribb's work both reveal the hidden racial politics of the interfaces of the most prevalent operating systems in the world, and also propose sort of alternative configurations in which blackness is not opposed to, but sort of interwoven with technology. So, just as a way of sort of concluding, in the next stage of my project, together with Rafael and Felipe and others, I'm going to take inspiration from artists such, or we're going to take inspiration from artists such as Cribb, and explore creative approaches to exposing and imagining alternatives to algorithmic racisms. So I've received some funding to start developing a new game with Instituto Pro Comum, who I mentioned, which they contributed to the report I mentioned, as well as Caixa Lochi Produções and Aoka Games Lab. So while Cribb's work is really interesting as a kind of digital literacy tool, but is also arguably quite sort of elitist in nature, what we're hoping to do is use the medium of digital play, of video games, to reach a kind of broader audience. But again, I'm just right at the beginning of using these methodologies and exploring these different forms. So, and I'm sure lots of you know a lot more about them than I do. So I'd really appreciate feedback or comments or anything you'd like to offer. Right, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, Q&A time. If you're watching online, stick your questions in the chat. And if you have a question, raise your hand and please wait for the microphone to come to you. Otherwise, the people online will not be able to hear what you're saying. Speak very clearly into the microphone. So, any questions? Martin? Thanks, Daniel.
So I was wondering how some of these ideas about racial identity intersect with ideas about indigeneity in Brazil. And like, I was particularly struck using a lot of cannibalism metaphors early on.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how do indigenous communities in Brazil feel about that as a metaphor?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's incredible how, the use of indigeneity to define ideas about national identity goes back to the 19th century, where, when Brazil was just trying to formulate a national identity at the time, lots of people resorted to imagine completely fictitious ideas about indigenous identity and images of indigenous people to construct a sort of prehistory of the Brazilian nation in this kind of form of indigenism. And this sort of recurs throughout the 20th century in that metaphor. It's used very sort of ironically by Oswaldo de Andrade in the 1920s, but it also seems to be a weird blind spot, both in the kind of racial politics of the protest movements of the 1960s and also in the digital, its sort of revival in the concept of digitophagia, which is a combination of digital literacies and the idea of anthropophagy. So these are parts of the sort of subterranean racial policies of digital cultures in Brazil we're starting to interrogate. I didn't mention the role of indigeneity in Italy because our focus is slightly different, but basically through the early 2000s, it wasn't a focus of debate, and it's only been in the last 10 years or so that it has become that. And so now one of the things we're trying to do alongside these more sort of collaborative aspects of the project is to create a sort of different history of these digital media activist movements, it's sort of a sort of racial history of these projects, because that was such a blind spot during the time. Yeah, their usage of these problematic metaphors that revive these romantic ideas from the 19th century and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Lau Tim at the back.
Hey, yeah, I've got a question from Tony, who says that was so good, by the way. Tony asks, to what extent do you think the barriers and issues you've highlighted are specific to Brazil, and can we universalize these themes at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you've got to start somewhere, don't you? And one of the things I tried to do in the project was show how kind of the result of chance it was. It's my weirdly specific expertise and interests, plus the kind of amazing experience of my partner Felipe, who's been working so closely in these movements since the early 2000s, and then the artistic side of things with Rafael. So Brazil is our starting point in it, but all members of the team have connections elsewhere, and I think it's sort of later stage of the project we're going to think more about international connections. So with the video game, Felipe, he's from Brazil and researches about Brazil, but he's based in Berlin and does some work with Tactical Tech, also based in Berlin, and they're interested in our work on the game. So we're already starting to explore sort of international connections. But one of the things I'm really interested in doing is that the debates around algorithmic racism or biases embedded within software systems are so dominated by scholars and voices from North America mainly, but also Europe, that what I want to do in my project is give voice to and sort of create a project that sort of amplifies perspectives from elsewhere. And I can do that with Brazil because that's where my contacts are and that's where my research focuses. So it's really to produce a sort of perspective from the global south on this project that's been so dominated by Europe and North America, and unjustly so, seeing as Brazil was so central to developing these digital inclusion initiatives in the early 2000s. It was an incredible experiment. The amount of money that was in there, and how the degree to which it was influential on the subsequent development of cultural projects. I mean, I've lost count of the number of producers, filmmakers, and so on, who cite these pontos de cultura as points of, the sort of foundations for their work with digital media, because it just gave access to a whole generation. And at the time, people from elsewhere started to use that as a model for thinking about community access to digital technology. So it's kind of, drawing attention to that experience as well.
Amy, then Susie.
Thanks, Ed. That was is it on? Yeah.
It is on. You just won't hear it come out of the speakers.
Oh, sorry. It was so interesting. Thank you. I was curious about why you wanted to make a video game rather than another kind of thing, and knowing how it was.
Yeah.
Because am I right in thinking you hadn't made a video game before?
No, never.
How was it?
Okay, so yeah. The pandemic played a role in so it started off by Rafael and I thought we would. He's a comic book. He's won loads of awards as a graphic novelist. he's got a huge following, and that he's never made a video game before. And the original plan was to run a workshop with one particular digital inclusion organization in the north of Brazil, and to run a workshop with them and the communities they work with, and produce a kind of series of short comics, like in collaboration with them, around the theme of digital inclusion and what it means to them and that kind of thing. Then the pandemic happened, we couldn't do face-to-face workshops, so we kind of went back to the drawing board and decided to, rather than work with one organization, to kind of do a report that sort of maps the whole field of most of the organizations working in that area. And then we thought, we just started thinking about the most effective medium to raise awareness, to function as a kind of educational tool, and that might actually spread beyond the normal circuits. And I think during a recent presidential campaign in Brazil, lots of people have been using these sort of persuasive games that have been doing the rounds really effectively. So yeah, like I said, quite naively, we thought, oh, let's give it a go. And so the initial phase was just sort of designing it, the aesthetics, the narrative, and starting to think about gameplay. But again, not that much. And it was only when we got these Alka Game Lab involved that it all kind of came together, and now it's actually a functioning thing. And they sort of sat us down and thought, you haven't thought about anything to do with it. And yeah, so literally the meeting we had yesterday was this kind of revelation where the ideas that we had been working on for so long and the aesthetic that we've been sort of putting together was now sort of functioning. And you could see how it's like, oh yeah, people play games because they like to little tasks and all. Yeah, so the joy of doing collaborative work is that you don't have to be an expert in every aspect of it. You can get other people on board. And that's something that I'm like embracing at the moment. Yeah.
Good for you. Susie.
I was going to say, that sounds like a whole other talk.
Yeah.
So I was really struck at the beginning when you said about the network providers, like zero-rated, some of the social media platforms, and a lot of what you're doing sort of feels quite disruptive and grassroots, so like a bottom-up approach. Is there an aspiration to then sort of sandwich it with a top-down and influence the policymakers? And
yeah, actually there is. So that report that we put together, the interviews for it were just so good. It just revealed this whole kind of wealth of experience that hadn't been captured. Lots of these organizations' websites had just sort of disappeared from the early 2000s, and lots of the archive from that period just has gone. So we thought, right, we would like to do something that preserves their experience and preserves it for the future, but also uses it as a kind of seed for future projects, because Brazil at the time was at this point where nothing seemed possible, and it was in the middle of the Bolsonaro regime, and Felipe had been away from Brazil for a while, having been really closely involved in policy around that, and had been sort of really important in sort of shaping policy around that for so long. But he had this desire to go back to Brazil and to kind of get back into that world. So we applied for some money, and we turned those interviews into this online resource, sort of archive of educational resources for helping community organizations run sort of community technology projects and so on. And that has, and then now that with the results of the elections, suddenly everyone's very excited in that world and think, right, something is possible now. So we're applying for something else to be able to put together a network of experts, both from the kind of third sector and also academia, to try and shape policy in the first year of the new government's existence. And again, this is something that me on my own as a kind of cultural studies scholar wouldn't be able to do, but it's through these networks and through also putting together people within my institution who have more experience with in sort of in policy and shaping policy. So yeah, that's something that hopefully is going to be central to what we do over the next couple of years. Yeah, thanks.
Great questions, everyone. We've got time for one more, if anyone else has anything they'd like to ask. No one on the internet? Cool, and then a round of applause for Ed, please. Thank you. So, this is our last talk of the year, our last Open Studio Friday of the year. So check the website for our January talks, which will be going live soon. We'll be back next year with more Open Studio Fridays, Producer Wednesdays, lunchtime talks, etc. I want to say a big thank you to Jack at the back, because this is his last time with us. Jack has weathered some technical storms with us on a number of occasions, and we are going to miss him. He's going to continue his work with Condense, who are based downstairs, who are doing some really amazing stuff with the metaverse, so check that out as well. Thank you all for being here for today and making the effort to come and check out the talk. We'll see you all again in 2023.
Thank you.